In this video, we're going to look at multidimensional arrays in Java. First, we're going to declare them, then we're going to initialize them, and then we will be iterating through those arrays in multiple ways. At this point, you should be familiar with a regular array. For example, here we have a 5-element integer array. It has a fixed size. Each array has to be created with a certain fixed size. This one was created with 5 elements. We have a designated first element at index 0, and we have a designated fifth element. Now at some point I may want to represent my data in a different way, and I may want to add a separate row of data. Like this. Now I have 2 rows, I have 5 columns, and I could go, for example, a step further, and I could add even a third row if I wanted to, or a fourth, or a fifth, or whatever. Now I'm ending up with a matrix. I've got myself a 3-row matrix with 5 columns. I could add even a third dimension, or a fourth, or a fifth, but let's say we have 3 dimensions. A 3-dimensional array could look something like this. We have a couple of rows, a couple of columns, and then we have this third dimension, which is in this picture displayed as extra layers that are placed in front of each other. Okay, now let's declare a matrix. What I have here so far is a regular array. It has been declared, but it hasn't been initialized. It's an array of ints, and as you can see from the square brackets here, it's actually an array. If I want to create a 2-dimensional array, I'm going to have to use an extra pair of square brackets. So for example, I could type this int square brackets, call it matrix, to give myself, or to declare, a variable called matrix pointing to a 2-dimensional array. And I can see it's a 2-dimensional array because I've used 2 pairs of brackets. If I want to make a 3-dimensional array, I would have to use an extra pair of brackets. I could use int, I could use primitives, I could use doubles, or I could use any class available. For example, I could say string, and then I could say 3D array, 3-dimensional array. Now I'm using the string type, and I've used 3 pairs of brackets to declare a 3-dimensional array. Okay, so now let's initialize these arrays, these multidimensional arrays. Let's take this matrix, for example. I could initialize it in a couple of different ways. If I know upfront which elements are going to be placed in these arrays or in this matrix, I could use this notation. I could use a curly braces, and I could specify my elements. So I could do it like this. I could say 1, 2, 3, and I could say 4, 5, and 6. These are 2 dimensions, which matches my 2 pairs of brackets. This is the first element, and this is the second element. The first row and the second row, they are separated by a colon, a comma, and then each element in here is made up of an array itself. So I've got an array of arrays, and that is why I need an extra pair of curly braces. My first array is the first element, or the first row, and my second array is the second element, or the second row. And this is separating these 2 elements. I could also initialize my int matrix in a different way. If I don't know the values up front, I could write something like new int, and I could write something like this. But in this case, I'm going to have to say, okay, give me 2 rows and perhaps 3 columns, which matches this declaration. But in this case, I don't have any 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 in my matrix 2. All of my cells will be initialized with a value of 0. Same for the strings here. I could write new string 3-dimensional array, which has 2 rows, 3 columns, and maybe also 3 layers. Okay, now let's iterate through this matrix. I'm going to pick this one because it has the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in it. I'm going to write a for loop, and I'm going to say for int I equals 0, I is smaller than the length of this matrix, which is something that we've seen is also present in a regular matrix, and I'm going to say I++. I can actually access matrix.length even though it has two dimensions and two lengths. What is actually matrix.length? What does that represent here? Well, it represents the first dimension. A matrix or a multidimensional array is actually an array of arrays. So matrix.length is telling me how many arrays are there. So I've got array 1 and I've got array 2. So the length of my matrix will actually be 2. First element, second element. So my I will range from 0 to 1 because it's smaller than 2. Now, once I've got that, I still have to iterate through each of these individual arrays. And that's what I'm going to do using a second for loop. So I'm going to say for int j equals 0. J is smaller than the current row. The current row is matrix row. Oh, matrix I. The length, and I'm going to increment my j. So now my j will be ranging from 0 up to the current row's length. And as you can see, each row has a length of 3. This one has a length of 3 and this one has a length of 3. So my j will go from 0 to 1 to 2. It will never be 3 because it's strictly smaller than the length of the current row. So here I'm accessing the matrix's length, which is 2 elements, and here I'm accessing the current row, matrix I's length. So matrix I, matrix 0 is this first array, first element in this outer array. So matrix 0 is this one, and matrix 1 will be this one. They both have a length of 3, so my j will go from 0 to 3. Now if I want to print my elements, I can actually use my second dimension as well. And now I'm going to write this system.out.print matrix, and then I'm going to use I and j. And now I'm finally using my second dimension as well. Let's give this a try. And I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. First dimension, second dimension. Makes sense. I'm accessing a specific element. Here I'm accessing only the first dimension. So here I'm accessing a row within, an entire row within a matrix, which has a length, of course, but because each array, each row has a length. Okay, now let's use a for each loop to go through this matrix, to traverse this matrix. So I'm grabbing my matrix. My matrix is made up of multiple arrays. So the actual type that I need to put here is int array. So my matrix is a collection of rows. Each row is an int array. So I'm traversing first element, which is an int array, second element, which is an int array. Each time, each iteration of this for loop, I will be handed a different row, a different array of ints will be handed to me. Printing this row here is something that is quite easy to do if you know how to do it using a regular array. So I can just grab row. I can press Control Q in IntelliJ, and you will see that row is an int array, as you can see here. So this is a genuine regular int array, and I could just take each and every element and call it, for example, value. I can print this, and I could, value of course, and I could see if this works. Let's give that a try. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So again, I am using the fact that this is an array of 2 arrays, and each element here, each element in my matrix is now actually a row, and this row can easily be printed using a regular for each. This is an int array and this is an int value, and so I will be printing each and every element. So we've seen declaration of multidimensional arrays like this, a two-dimensional array or a three-dimensional array. We can use any type. We can use int, string, or custom types can be used, and each pair of square brackets will correspond to a dimension. So here we have a two-dimensional matrix or a two-dimensional array, and here we have a three-dimensional array. Initialization can be done using this syntax, using the array literal syntax. If I want to use the array literal syntax like this, I'm going to have to use it on the same line as the declaration, unless I want to put new int here as well, but that's a small detail. So I've got two dimensions here. I've got two pairs of square brackets, so I'm gonna have to use two levels of curly braces, first row, second row, my colon, my comma, and here I can also choose to initialize this matrix using just 2 rows and 3 columns without actually giving these a value. They will be assigned the value 0. So these are the two ways in which I can initialize them. Now, traversing an array using indices, for example, I could use I and j, or I could use row and col or column as variable names. So the row, are first traversing the rows from 0 up to the matrix's length. So I will be getting each and every row. And then in the nested loop, on the second level, I will be going through each row, and I will be using a column variable to traverse this specific row. Using a for each, I can do the same thing, and I could call my matrix. I could take it, and I could take each and every row of my matrix. I have to use the correct type here. I'm using ints, so this is an int array, and then I can simply, within the inner for loop, I can simply traverse my one-dimensional array here, which is called row.